In a world where every conversation is monitored, delayed, or cut short without warning, one phone call can decide whether a person survives the night mentally intact. This is the hidden battlefield behind prison walls, where 55 phone calls reveal the fragile line between connection, collapse, and the fight to stay human. This documentary is created for educational and awareness purposes, based on verified research and real correctional data. If you value honest, non-fiction investigations into psychology and incarceration, like, comment, and subscribe to support future deep dive episodes. When the outside world becomes too loud. Phone calls are supposed to pull inmates out of the prison environment for a moment, but sometimes, the outside world brings more noise than comfort. Research cited by the American Psychological Association shows that inmates often experience information overload shock during calls. Because they receive updates in sudden, compressed bursts, their minds can struggle to process news that unfolds gradually in the free world. To the caller, it's just life happening. To the inmate, it's a tidal wave. One inmate in a northern state facility described a phone call that changed his entire week. His family updated him on everything at once. A cousin moving out, a job layoff, an argument between relatives, someone selling the family car. Nothing was catastrophic, but the rapid flow of information overwhelmed him. He later told a researcher, "Out there, you hear these things little by little. In here, it hits you all at once." The Chicago Crime Lab confirmed this pattern. Inmates often have higher stress responses to clustered updates than to single emotional events. Not because the news is worse, but because the brain cannot adjust fast enough. Another inmate's experience adds depth to this phenomenon. He received a call from his friend who treated the conversation like any normal catch-up, talking fast, filling every second, updating him on neighborhood drama, relationship issues, even new apps and trends. But when the call ended, the inmate said he felt like he had just been dropped back into a world he didn't understand anymore. This psychological distance is widely documented. Professor John Irwin wrote that long-term incarceration creates a time freeze, where the inmate's inner world stays locked while everything outside continues evolving. Phone calls become brief windows into a timeline they are no longer part of. One of the most striking examples came from a CDCR review involving a man who had been incarcerated since before smartphones were common. During a call, his nieces talked casually about social media, digital payments, and online schooling. To them, it was everyday life. To him, it felt like staring into a future he hadn't caught up to. He later described the moment as trying to understand a language that sounds familiar but makes no sense. This chapter reveals a subtle but powerful psychological truth. Phone calls don't always reconnect inmates. Sometimes they remind them how disconnected they've become. And yet, they keep calling. Because even when the outside world feels overwhelming, confusing, or painfully distant, it is still their world, their people, their anchor to identity. Even if the world has moved faster than they expected, even if the updates come too quickly, even if they can't process everything, those calls remain the only glimpse of a life waiting for them beyond release. The outside world may feel loud, but silence is still louder. The calls that reopen old wounds. Some phone calls don't bring updates, comfort, or reassurance. Some reopen wounds the inmate tried to bury long before they ever entered a cell. According to studies referenced by the American Psychological Association, unresolved trauma is often reignited through emotionally charged conversations, especially when inmates have no physical space or privacy to process what resurfaces. One inmate described a call he received from an estranged relative he hadn't spoken to in years. The moment he heard the voice on the line, memories he had spent years suppressing rushed back, arguments from childhood, betrayals, moments he wished he had handled differently. The call wasn't hostile, but it broke open parts of him he wasn't prepared to face inside a controlled environment. This reaction is confirmed by research from Craig Haney, who explains that the loss of autonomy inside prison intensifies emotional vulnerability. When someone re-enters an inmate's life unexpectedly, the mind has no buffer, no space to prepare, no ability to step away, no chance to collect thoughts. In one Western correctional facility documented by CDCR, An inmate received a call from a parent who had been absent for decades. The intention was reconciliation. But the inmate stood completely still as the voice apologized, laughed nervously, and tried to rebuild a relationship within minutes. The static-filled apology triggered confusion, anger, and grief all at once. Later he explained to staff that the call wasn't painful because of what was said, it was painful because it arrived without warning. Inside prison, emotional ambushes have a stronger impact. Another case appears in a study referenced by the Chicago Crime Lab. An inmate learned during a phone call that a childhood friend had passed away months earlier. The family wasn't hiding the truth. Communication had simply broken down, numbers changed, messages lost. But when the news finally reached him, it didn't come gently. It arrived through a short, monitored call, with barely enough time to process the first sentence before the line cut off. Psychologists describe this as compressed trauma, where inmates are forced to absorb life-changing information without time, privacy, or emotional support. The world outside moves on. Inside, the inmate is left standing with a receiver in hand, carrying the weight alone. What makes these calls uniquely painful isn't the content, it's the environment. Painful memories, unresolved family issues, or sudden losses feel sharper behind walls because there is nowhere to place the emotion afterward. No walk outside. No long talk with someone. No private moment to breathe. An inmate once said after a difficult call, "They opened the wound, but the place I'm in won't let it heal." This chapter uncovers a truth rarely seen by the public. Phone calls can reconnect. They can comfort. But they also pull ghosts from the past into the present, forcing inmates to confront emotional wounds in a place where healing is nearly impossible. And yet, many still answer every call. Because even when the past hurts, the silence hurts more. The children who age too fast. When adults walk into a prison visiting room, they already understand the rules. Children don't. Yet according to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, children with incarcerated parents show stress responses that mirror adults exposed to chronic uncertainty, faster heart rates, emotional shutdown, and forced maturity long before they're ready. A father in a verified CDCR family interview described his daughter's visits this way. "She was 5 when I got locked up. By the time she was 7, she didn't act like a kid anymore." Psychologists call this premature role adaptation, when children step into emotional roles that don't match their age. They comfort the parent. They protect the remaining caregiver. They hide their fear to avoid making things worse. The prison environment accelerates this process. One child reported to the Chicago Crime Lab that he practiced not moving too much in the visiting room so guards wouldn't think he was misbehaving. He didn't understand the rules, he only understood the pressure. Another child described the moment metal detectors went off as feeling like I did something wrong, even though he didn't. These small moments build psychological patterns. Kids learn to monitor themselves constantly. They learn to anticipate danger in harmless situations. They learn to smile when they are confused or afraid. This is not rebellion. This is survival. Researchers from the American Psychological Association warn that repeated exposure to environments built on surveillance can lead children to develop hyperawareness, a state where they overanalyze tone, posture, and reactions, even in normal life. Many children stop asking questions. They stop expressing frustration. Some even take on the responsibility of keeping the family strong, a burden that belongs to adults, not a 10-year-old. But one of the most overlooked impacts is this. Children start building memories not around their parents' life, but around the prison. The drive. The search. The waiting. The goodbye. These become core childhood experiences. And when those memories shape identity, psychologists warn of intergenerational emotional strain, a pattern where the child grows up learning to suppress emotions the same way their parent had to inside. The prison sentence stretches far beyond the inmate. It reaches straight into the future of the child, silently rewriting their emotional playbook before they ever understand what a prison really is. The partners who hold everything together and fall apart in silence. For partners of incarcerated people, prison visiting becomes a second full-time job, one built on emotional labor, financial strain, and quiet endurance. According to findings from the National Institute of Justice, Partners often experience a psychological pattern called dual role stress. They must act as both emotional support for the inmate and the stable foundation for the family at home. But this balance comes with hidden fractures. A woman visiting her husband in a Colorado state prison told researchers, "I had to be strong in front of him. But every time I left, the moment the doors closed behind me, I cried in the parking lot." This is not weakness. It's the cost of constantly switching between two identities. The comforting partner inside the visiting room. The overwhelmed provider outside of it. Psychologist Craig Haney explains that this emotional divide often produces relationship dissonance, where partners feel obligated to project hope even when they feel exhaustion, resentment, or loneliness. Partners rarely talk about these feelings, and the prison environment makes it worse. During visits, conversations are filtered. Every sentence must fit within rules, time limits, and emotional control. Partners may avoid difficult topics because they don't want the inmate to feel powerless. Inmates may avoid asking questions because they don't want to sound demanding. The result: a relationship built on edited emotions. Real inmate accounts confirm this tension. In a verified interview from a Midwestern correctional study, a man said, "My wife always smiled during visits. I didn't realize until I came home how much she was hiding from me." These suppressed emotions become a kind of psychological weight. Partners experience chronic anticipatory grief, fearing what might happen inside. Economic pressure, juggling bills, travel costs, and commissary support. Social isolation, friends and family who don't understand. Emotional inversion, being strong for someone who is physically protected but emotionally vulnerable. The American Psychological Association notes that people in high-support roles without reciprocal support often develop burnout symptoms identical to those seen in caregiving professions. But unlike nurses or therapists, partners receive no training, no rest days, and no mental health buffer. They carry the relationship. They carry the household. They carry the future. And they carry it quietly. Because for many, expressing the truth feels like betrayal, even when they're the ones keeping everything from falling apart. The emotional crash after the visit. The moment a visit ends, two completely different worlds split apart again, and the psychological impact hits both sides instantly. Research from the National Institute of Justice shows that the most intense emotional damage doesn't occur during the visit. It happens after it. For families, the emotional crash comes the moment the door closes behind them. A mother interviewed in a verified Chicago crime lab study described it plainly. The air outside felt heavier, like I was leaving him behind all over again. Psychologists call this post-visit separation shock, a sudden emotional drop triggered by shifting from connection back to isolation. The brain struggles to adjust, especially after suppressing emotions inside the facility. Partners often experience it as sudden anger they can't explain. Guilty relief that the visit is over. Overwhelming sadness on the drive home. A feeling of emotional numbness the rest of the day. These reactions are not irrational. They are the mind trying to restabilize after holding too much inside. But the inmate's emotional crash is even sharper. Inside the prison, visits interrupt the psychological defenses inmates build to survive. The routines, the emotional walls, the focus on control. Prison psychologist Craig Haney documented that inmates returning from visits often experience a state called emotional whiplash. The sudden transition from human connection to institutional coldness. One incarcerated man in a verified CDCR interview said, "Visits were the best part of my sentence, and the worst part of my week. The moment I walked back, it felt like someone ripped the world away." Back in their cell, inmates often show increased irritability, withdrawal from others, sudden bursts of silence, trouble sleeping, loss of emotional regulation. None of this is about weakness. It's about the brain trying to reconcile two opposing realities. According to the American Psychological Association, abrupt emotional separation activates the same neural pathways associated with grief and disorientation. And prisons are structured in a way that magnifies that feeling. Guards frequently order inmates to move quickly after goodbyes. Doors slam. Lights buzz. Voices bark commands. There is no space for processing, no moment to breathe, no time to restore psychological balance. Families drive home with their thoughts. Inmates walk back into concrete. Both sides are hurting. Both sides pretend they're fine. And the system continues operating as if the emotional fallout is simply part of the routine. The visit ends. But the impact is only beginning. Long-term psychological consequences. The effects of prison visits ripple far beyond the hour or two in the visiting room. Decades of research from Haney, Irwin, and the Chicago Crime Lab confirm that the cumulative psychological impact shapes relationships, emotional health, and family dynamics long after the visit ends. For inmates, repeated visits create a paradoxical effect. They can improve morale, reduce institutional aggression, and strengthen social bonds, but only if the visits are emotionally consistent and supportive. Otherwise, inconsistent or stressful visits intensify anxiety, depression, and feelings of isolation, according to verified NIJ studies. One CTAR inmate explained, "When my sister came, it was the best day. When she didn't show up, it ruined me for the next week. It's like a pendulum that never stops." Psychologists identify this as emotional volatility due to intermittent reinforcement, a cognitive pattern where unpredictable emotional rewards create heightened stress and attachment issues. For families, repeated exposure to this high-stress environment produces long-term anticipatory grief and chronic hypervigilance, particularly in children. According to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, children of incarcerated parents are more likely to develop anxiety disorders, behavioral challenges, emotional dysregulation, premature adulthood responsibilities. Partners and caregivers often experience relationship burnout, where the stress of balancing their own life with the needs of the inmate and family creates chronic psychological strain. The long-term consequences are not only emotional but neurobiological. APA research shows chronic stress can alter the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and impulse control, and amygdala hyperactivity, which governs fear and emotional reactions. In other words, visits designed to maintain connection can paradoxically reinforce stress pathways, making coping with prison life and post-prison reintegration far more complicated. Systemic impact. Families under stress may avoid visits altogether, weakening bonds. Inmates may disengage emotionally, increasing risk of institutional behavioral issues. Children may carry emotional patterns into adulthood, potentially influencing future relationships and mental health. In short, the prison visit is not a neutral event. It is a psychological crucible, shaping the minds of everyone involved. Strategies, coping, and resilience. Despite the intense psychological toll, families and inmates develop strategies to survive the emotional storm of prison visits. 1. Preparing emotionally. Research from Haney and the APA highlights that families who rehearse emotions before visits, acknowledging fears and expectations, report less stress afterward. Children benefit from simple explanations about what to expect, which reduces anticipatory anxiety and premature role adaptation. 2. Structured visits. Consistent visitation schedules are critical. Inmates in CDCR studies who received visits at predictable intervals demonstrated better emotional regulation and fewer disciplinary issues. Families who maintain predictable routines, what to say, when to arrive, and how to leave, report fewer post-visit crashes. 3. Communication outside the visiting room. Letters, phone calls, and video messages can reduce the pressure of live visits. NIJ research shows that combining multiple communication methods lowers emotional volatility in both inmates and families. 4. Professional support. Access to mental health professionals is a protective factor. Therapists can teach coping mechanisms for hypervigilance, emotional masking, and post-visit separation shock. Partners and caregivers who participate in therapy are better able to maintain relationships and prevent burnout. 5. Acknowledging the trauma. Perhaps most importantly, families and inmates benefit from naming the emotional impact, recognizing it is real, normal, and systemic. Studies by the Chicago Crime Lab emphasize that awareness alone can reduce guilt, shame, and isolation, creating a foundation for resilience. Prison visits are far more than a routine or obligation. They are a psychological crucible, shaping children, partners, and inmates alike. Every hug, every word, every goodbye carries weight. And every family affected bears a story the system cannot erase. Understanding these hidden psychological dynamics is not just academic. It is a step toward empathy, support, and systemic change. Collision, if this documentary opened your eyes to the hidden realities of prison visitation, make sure to like, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe for more deep dives into the psychology of life behind bars. Your engagement helps these untold stories reach thousands in the first 24 hours, and ensures families, children, and inmates finally have their experiences acknowledged.